Hello, and welcome to our second episode of Impact TV. Impact TV, a Publicis Sapient and Constellation Research joint initiative, is a 6-episode limited series focused on technology as a force for good and its positive impact on business and people. In today's episode, we'll focus on the transformative power of accessibility. We'll explore how accessibility fosters inclusivity, drives equality, and empowers communities. Our accomplished panel of 3 industry experts and thought leaders will share insights as they discuss strategies enabled by technology and AI that all business needs to embrace to shape a more accessible and inclusive digital world. And joining me in this discussion is my co-host, Wang. Ray is the chairman, founder, and principal analyst for Constellation Research, and also a very well-known author and 2 amazing books.
Hey, thanks a lot, Teresa. And I'm here with my other amazing co-host, Teresa Barreira. She's the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at the leading global digital consultancy, Publicis Sapient. If Teresa's creative thinking, coupled with 25 years of global marketing experience, especially on the B2B side, has enabled her to break the mold of traditional marketing for tech and services companies. But more importantly, we're here with amazing guests, and we will have our guests introduce themselves. So starting in reverse order, Dr. David Bray from the Stimson Center. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, great to be here with you, Ray and Teresa. And I am a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. That simply means that I have served in enough variety of capacities that they now don't know what to call me. But what I am tackling is the People-Centered Internet Coalition, which was actually something that I started working with Madeline and Vint Cerf, co-creator of the Internet, back in 2017. And with the People-Centered Internet Coalition, we could see even then the challenges of open societies and the internet. How do we, one, make sure that it is actually accessible and inclusive of everybody? But then similarly also, how do we actually make sure that the internet actually uplifts communities? And so I'm excited to be talking to you in that capacity, as well as some other hats that I've worn along the way.
That's wonderful. Thank you, David, for joining us. FrancisWest, founder of FrancisWest Co. Please tell us about where you're coming in from today and what we're talking about. In a little bio.
Well, I'm usually based in Boston, but I'm sending my greetings from New York City. I am a author and also founder, like you mentioned, of FrancisWest Co. And it is a global strategy advisory boutique company working with government and also private sectors and a startup to really embed, accessibility as part of the digital transformation strategy. And Dr. Bray and I actually met through the people-centered internet when I always say graduated from IBM after 37 years. I hung out my own shingles, and then one of the first event actually was to go to I4J, or Innovation for Jobs event hosted by Vint Cerf, and it's great to be back in the fold, so to speak, and meet up with some of my new acquired colleagues and acquaintances.
Amazing how small the world is and how amazing people get together. So welcome, Francis. So Alison Walden, accessibility lead at Publicis Sapient. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Ray. My name is Alison Walden. I am a Vice President of Technology and the Accessibility Lead globally for Publicis Sapient. I run our Accessibility Center of Excellence. And my job is to help guide our clients and teams through the process of creating accessible digital experiences. And I'm very excited to be here with this group today.
All right, this is great. Welcome, everybody. And we will begin our first interview. And we'll start that with, of course, Alison Walden. So, all right.
Alison, welcome. In your current role as you partner with many organizations, to embed accessibility into their ways of working. So can we, to orient the audience here around what does mean to create accessible experiences? Can you tell us what does that term mean in sort of in the world that we live today?
Sure, Teresa, it's a great orienting question. So when we talk about digital accessibility, it simply means that all people can access a digital experience. So a website, an app, a kiosk, whatever you can think of, however they need to navigate. So we often think of people navigating with a mouse pointing device or a touch screen, but someone might also need to navigate by keyboard alone, with a screen reader or some other kind of assistive technology. So we say an experience is accessible if people can access it however they need to access it. And you might not even realize that this is an issue if you're a mouse user or a touchscreen user, because guess what? Everything will probably work for you just fine. But it is a big problem today. Many digital experiences have accessibility barriers that would prevent people from achieving their goals, depending on how they navigate. Other experiences might not have barriers, but they'd still be really annoying and time-consuming to use if you were navigating some other way than with a mouse. And this is really important because there are over 1 billion people in the world with permanent disabilities who might need to access digital content and functionality in different ways. And there's an even larger number of people with temporary or situational disabilities who would also benefit from accessible experiences, including our aging population. You know, our philosophy at Publicis Sapient, as you know, is that when we make a digital experience accessible, it improves it for all audiences.
You know, that's actually really interesting, Alison, as we're talking about that, because we've seen new devices pop up, right? And we're seeing, for example, the ability to use gestures, to be able to use voice, the ability, to connect with like eye tracking, right? There's going to be a lot more interesting conversations about where accessibility is headed. And just like the advent of the internet, there's some massive advances in accessibility, right? Think about what happens, right? In having to go to a grocery store before, right? And if you're someone who is blind, now you actually don't have to worry about that physical grocery store issue, without assistance, right? Because before there were no online grocery stores, right? And today, now everything's available digitally. We can actually kind of change this, and hopefully there's some benefits to folks that have disabilities. What have you seen in that transition as we've gone from physical to online to the shifts in accessibility?
That's a great question, Ray. The advent of digital technology has definitely led to some huge advances for people with disabilities. And one I'm thinking about right now is, for example, Google Maps being made available on smartphones like back in 2008 or so, right? Like this made a huge difference in the navigation capabilities for people who are blind, for example, in addition to, being an amazing tool for everyone. But actually, the promise of the internet was not fulfilled for many people with disabilities. Studies show that more than 96% of websites have accessibility issues. And I'm glad you mentioned online grocery stores, because that's a great example, something we can all relate to, I think, especially since the pandemic. With the advent of the internet, to your point, people thought this is a great way for people with disabilities to gain independence, right? Provide them a way to do their own grocery shopping. And if you were able to use online grocery stores to avoid going out during the pandemic, ask yourself how you would have felt if the grocery store website just didn't work for you, for the way you navigate. Because I've tested grocery store websites and most of them have accessibility barriers that would prevent some people from placing an order depending on how they navigate online. And this is unnecessary, right? It's totally possible to make accessible digital experiences, and it's even required by law to do so in many countries. Now, of course, the potential is still there to turn this around, right? And finally make experiences accessible for people.
So, Alison, that's very interesting. So what's keeping people, what are the barriers keeping organizations from doing this?
Well, another great question and a bit of a complicated answer. I feel like experiences keep getting less and less accessible over time since the advent of the internet, because the complexity of the experiences is increasing, and there's a lot of things exacerbating this. But I feel like the root of the problem is that most teams creating the digital experiences today, they don't understand the variety of ways that people access those experiences that they're creating online. As I keep saying, not just with a mouse, but with a keyboard alone, screen reader, etc. So they find it difficult to create experiences that work for people who navigate different ways. And this makes sense, right? People would be good at making experiences that work with a mouse if that's how they navigate. But where they fail is in trying to create an experience that works for an input modality that they're not familiar with. Think about it. I always say it would be like asking someone who only ever drove a car to design the perfect bicycle.
Lovely.
We would never do that, right? And I really think this is one of the most critical aspects of the problem to understand. If we had more people with disabilities on teams creating digital experiences, then we would be able to benefit from their experience and insight. And the other thing that I want to mention is nobody's doing this on purpose, right? There's nobody out there saying, I don't want this experience to work for people, who navigate with a keyboard. Nobody says that. It's just something that happens when we don't enable our teams to consider digital accessibility. And there's a few things we need to do to make sure that they're able to do this, right? We need to enable them through training, because training courses in universities and colleges have not caught up to digital accessibility. A lot of them don't mention it at all. So we get new people coming to work at agencies who've never heard of it before. We need to train them. We need to give them time to review proposed functionality from an accessibility perspective. We need to enforce accessible ways of working. So thinking about accessibility from day one, not tacking it onto the end, testing in very specific ways with different input modalities. And we need to provide a specialist to help guide the teams, because this is a really deep skill set. It's not something that someone can just pick up overnight. Sometimes people, maybe someone listening to this is wondering if the experience they're creating is accessible. And I can tell you, if you're not doing something intentional to ensure that the digital experiences are accessible, then you're not doing it. It never happens by accident.
How do we make it, and you said some governments have made it a mandate, but how does we create a voice that companies actually force as consumers to say, hey, this is something you should be doing. It's not a nice to have, it's a must.
Well, one of the most important things is to make sure that it's driven top down at a company. I have a lot of experience myself trying to implement this at a grassroots level at different companies, and it doesn't work unless it's an initiative coming down from the top. So, for example, at Publicis Sapient, we have support from our senior leadership, and I've mentioned some of the best practices that we're following to get this in place for people at Publicis Sapient. Mandatory accessibility awareness and deep capability specific accessibility training. We do this across all of our speed capabilities. So we people in strategy, product, experience, engineering, and data, spells speed. We all have a collaborative part to play to ensure that the experiences we create are accessible. So we have tailor-made training for each of those capabilities. We make sure that we measure it, right? We include accessibility criteria in our engineering maturity model, for example. And we also we're working to make sure that our teams include accessibility specialists to guide everyone in the creation of accessible digital experiences. And those include people with lived experience of disability, so that we can benefit from their experience and insights. We also have awareness activities at Publicis Sapient. We do presentations from the disability community on Global Accessibility Awareness Day. We do hackathons. And you'll notice that a lot of the things I'm mentioning are people-related initiatives, because at the root of it, I think digital accessibility is mainly a people thing. The potential for experiences to be accessible has always existed. Just people didn't know about that potential or how to realize it. So we're really focusing, and I would encourage companies to focus on shifting mindsets and really enabling their people.
So that makes a lot of sense. But as the accessibility lead at Publicis Sapient, how do you partner with clients to actually improve that accessibility and inclusivity, especially, and getting them to see, why that's so important?
Well, Ray, a lot of times we'll get the opportunity up front when we're defining requirements. We can bring up the different accessibility requirements. And a lot of times if a client hasn't heard of the accessibility requirement we're talking about, we'll bring up, hey, how do you want it to work with the keyboard? They might never have thought about how something should work with the keyboard, right? A great example is error handling on a form, for example. And we can walk them through the different options and how it can work. Often at that point, their interest is piqued, right? And they will want to take our accessibility training. So our accessibility training that we originally developed to provide for our teams internally, we now provide it for our clients when they request it as well. And I find that as soon as you show someone how an experience works with a screen reader, as I said, nobody's doing this on purpose, right? Nobody intentionally wants their experience to not work for a huge audience of people. As soon as they experience it, right? Then that motivates them, right? They're like, oh no, I can make this better. And they want to do it at that point. It's usually not a tough sell. Yeah.
So last question, what was the message you wanted to give to the audience? What would you want to leave them with? So it's taken us 30 years since the internet has been around, and we are not even close to where we should be. We want to make sure that's not going to take another 30 years. So what's the message you want to leave the audience here?
Well, every year I try and think of a tagline for the Accessibility Center of Excellence. And the one I picked this year is do it right, and do it right now. right? And I really think it's an imperative. No one's doing this intentionally. Now's the time to get intentional about digital accessibility. If you've never thought about it before, that means it's not included in your products. So start thinking about it. There's no time to lose. You're missing out on this massive audience of people in the world.
Hey, thank you very much for being on the show, and thank you for sharing us those insights. I hope when we get into the metaverse and other areas, we'll hear more about how else we can do to actually improve this. So thank you so much. I learned a lot. This is pretty interesting, thinking about what's new and how about design for that accessibility. So let's bring on our next guest, FrancisWest. So,
and I feel
Francis.
like awareness is a huge issue. I don't think people like us that are aware of the issue and the lack of accessibility. But welcome, Francis.
That's a great point.
Thank you.
So Francis, welcome. And, as part of the alumni of the People-Centered Internet as well, I think we both worked there and worked under that guidance of understanding what about making the inclusive future ahead. Why is accessibility finally gaining attention and more visibility lately? As we heard from our last guest, it's something that's emerging. But how are we getting that there? And why is that happening today?
Yeah, I would say that accessibility really benefited from actually four major probably factors. And I start with actually the social movement. As you know, the past, I would say, decades started with, for example, the women's in tech industry, the Google walkout, famous Google walkout in 2015. And then there was a Me Too movement and Black Lives Matters and all that. I think society in general and every individual citizen is beginning to aware of their rights, and they're speaking up. And people with disability are, as a kind of constituents, are coming together and leveraging, for example, the social media to make their needs and wants known. And then secondly, I think technology really helped a lot. I think, and thanks to pandemic, everybody realized that technology is a given. So if we are going to use technology to connect the society, and the only way to connect with the society, then we really have to think about people with different abilities be able to participate. And the third, I think Alison mentioned a little bit, there is a huge demographic a change of an aging population. And let's face it, as we age, we automatically acquire disabilities. And you probably cannot relate, but if you're in the 50s, according to American Association of People with Disabilities, you're going to acquire, for example, first thing you're going to acquire is a vision impairment, right? You have to start reading using your reading glasses like bifocal lenses. And by the time you're 60, your hearing begin to go that ambient noises at airport, for example, bothers you. So reading caption or watching a video helps, right? By the time you're 70, your knees are beginning to go. So you become mobility challenged. By the time you're 80, cognitively, you're going to be gone. So demographic is
I feel so good about myself.
I don't think I want to age now.
So part of the reason I'm doing this work is I always jokingly said I started out doing it for other people, but now I'm doing it for myself. But last but not the least is legislation, right? I mean, later on, I hope we'll have a chance to talk about like emerging tech like AI. But there is a tremendous amount of legislation actually being levied, here in the United States. So of course, we have American with the Disability Act, but European Union just passed a very kind of comprehensive accessibility law. So if you are a company and you want to sell to, consumers, or you have employees, then the accessibility is not a nice to have, is a must have. So I think these four factors of a social expectation, technology, demographic, and also legislation is coming together to putting the focus on accessibility.
Oh, wow. Francis, you've been a huge advocate and voice for accessibility. And you've been advocating since your early days at IBM. And you were the first chief accessibility officer. I think actually you were the first in the industry. And you believe that the focus has to be much broader, much more than DEI. And sometimes companies might think of this as an HR initiative, but it has to be more of a company and a CEO imperative. How do you see that? And how do you make sure that companies think that way and make it more of a whole company imperative?
Yeah, I always tell people that I'm an accidental accessibility person. I spent actually 25 years in IBM sales and marketing. You can think of it as a mainstream selling hardware, software, opening, market like in China and installing, chip processors or, creating solution for Shanghai Stock Exchange and working with Allianz Insurance Company in Germany. So these are my kind of a core business initiative. And then I had the opportunity to go into IBM Research to head up the Human Ability and Accessibility Center. And I thought it was just going to be a 3-year, assignment like all the prior assignments I had at IBM. And then I ended up, I always say jokingly that it started out as a job and it became a career and it became a calling, right? And one of the things what I realized once I got into it was that, this is really technology for humanity, right? If you think about accessibility, for all the talk that we hear about, whether it's DEI or ESG, people talk about inclusion. But if you really want to have inclusion, and then if you agree that technology underpins everything we do, how we learn, how we work, and how we live, how we socialize, then by definition, you have to bring everybody along. So accessibility to me is its articulation of the technology's role in supporting human. So I have this idea that it really is about human first thinking, right? I mean, technology is a tool. It should not overcome or overtake humans. So that's why I think accessibility has to be a top down. And if any CEOs talk about digital transformation, which of course we know everybody's talking about that, or even artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence is trying to mimic human. And if you put human in the center, whether it's a people-centered internet or what I call the human first thinking, then the deduction of that logic is that accessibility is a must do. But today there is not that much of awareness, partially because I think if you think about the evolution of technology, in the first 30, 40, 50 years, when IBM was producing mainframe, it's really about productivity, efficiency, right? But now technology is in the form factor of a cell phone. So it's a personalized technology. When you start personalizing technology, then you really have to think about feature function of accessibility. And some people say, well, what is accessibility? Well, accessibility is little things like font size 14. I don't know about you, but when I read a Word document, I want font size 14. I want color contrast to be better on a website, right? Or when I'm watching a video, I would like to have captioning, especially if it's a foreign film or foreign language. These are actually, by definition, accessibility feature and functions. And just think about how, everybody can benefit from that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something about putting people at the center and people forward, and it's something that I deeply believe in that. And that technology should be the enabler. And technology, it is to help people. It's in service of people, not the other way around. But
Right.
How do we do that in the age of AI? How do we create solutions that place people at the center, accessible solutions that place people at the center in right now in the age of AI?
Well, if you think about people or human, then we know that and the human comes in very different kinds, it's just like a bell curve, right? And we have different abilities. And actually, one would say if you ask a evolutionist, they will say is the human diversity, makes human the most resilient creature in the world. And so I think, especially we're on the edge of starting this AI journey, that it is almost imperative that we take into consideration the entire bell curve. And a lot of times And when I was at IBM, when we were in research, when we look out the horizon, we think about how do you design a technology that actually accommodate or made available or usable by what we call the edge users. The edge users in this case, it could be people with disabilities, or it could be people who are aging in the 80s and 90s. If you can crack the code, so to speak, and create a solution that can be used, for example, an 89 years old person with a vision impairment, I can guarantee you the design thinking and the experience is going to be that much intuitive and that much elegant. And I still remember one of the senior VP and head of research said to me when I took the job, he says, simplicity is the most elegant form. And then what accessibility is about is really design and thinking about the solution that is so simple that it's intuitive. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why we have to think about, this different ability, different perspective, and different experience has to be codified into the AI logic and also the AI collection of data sets.
That's a great point, right? And designing for simplicity is not easy. Actually, it's more complicated to design for simplicity. Exactly. So that the burden of the experience is actually not put on the user, it's put on the designer so that everybody has it a lot easier. Given where we have advances in AI, is that something where we can actually see new opportunities emerge to actually do that so that we can actually deliver on that level of personalization?
Well, it's kind of funny because I listen to all these chat GPT, AI talk. But if you look at fundamentally, a lot of the AI basic technology, so for example, natural language processing, right? I mean, taking speech and translate it into text and then ingest that as part of the AI training. And the speech to text technology was originally designed for people with disabilities, right? So that was a foundational kind of accessibility technology, one could say, that actually gets mainstreamed. And of course, but it is a foundation. And then another technology, if you think about, remember the IBM Watson AI, one of the first use case was working with radiologists processing image, right? So image processing is another big part of the AI kind of a build out. And tagging things, like tagging, this is a dog, this is a cat, but that technology or that thinking actually is using technology for people who are blind. So when you say you create an accessible website and you show a picture, you need to put in what they call the alt text, alternative text describing what it is. But once you put that in there, it's good for the blind person or a person with a low vision. But at the same time, you're actually creating a data set that can be, leveraged and used. So there's actually such a synergy and the foundational usage, from the need of accessibility that can be transplanted over. But so that's why I always say, we should lead with accessibility, not think of it as an afterthought. And once you flip your thinking, it's like I see accessibility as a must-do everywhere. It's not like, do we have to train people to think about it? No, if you want to have your technology be used by everybody, isn't that what any business wants? Expand your market access. Then why would you not do it?
You get embedded into your thinking and your product. That's the way.
Exactly. But I know Alison mentioned aging. I mean, there will be like 1.3 billion people, right? I mean, already in Europe, 25% of population in Italy, in Spain is over 65. I mean, people think about Japan as an aging country, no, every country is aging with a diminishing birth rate. You're going to need technology to support, the entire society. And so why not start with, your solution and thinking and design, a product differentiation with accessibility built in now versus wait for later.
Yeah. Who do you think is doing it right?
Well, they are, by industry, I think the most industry that are consumer facing, the banks, the financial services, especially the banking industries, retail industries are definitely ahead of the curve. I think earlier I heard Alison talking about shopping. A Target, for example, at one point was sued by a UC Berkeley student of the website, of their website not being accessible. And that actually triggered a debate at the court whether a virtual marketplace is a place, because the ADA, American Disability Act, at that point was interpreted to only apply to physical space, like you need to have ramp and you need to have elevator. But what about virtual spaces? But since then, for example, Target has gone far beyond, and they partner, for example, with this technology startup company called Aira, AIRA. So any person who entered the Target, they can use their cell phone. They can have a remote agent come on to help the blind person shop at Target. They can also, Starbucks use the same technology from this company, Aira. How cool is that?
Very good.
Yeah,
this is amazing.
a holistic experience.
Well, Francis, this is amazing. We're with Francis West, founder of FrancisWest Co. She's an accessibility pioneer, champion, and change agent. Thank you so much for being on Impact TV.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Wow, we're learning a lot here today, right? So many advancements, so much change that has to happen. And of course, a lot of great progress as well. So let's see who we have next here. Look at that.
Ray. Hello, Teresa. How are you?
Hi. How are you? We're great. We're excited to have you. A great conversation.
Agreed. Definitely an important topic and happy to join in.
Well, we're super excited to have you. You've definitely been an early adopter and change agent in this space. So let's talk, let's take a step back in your early days in what we call the people-centered internet. You and I were part of that. And if you remember, there was a lot of talk about this People-Centered Internet Coalition on what we can do to get started, what it was like working with Vint Cerf, thinking about one of the fathers of the internet and a champion for accessibility.
Yes, so the People-Centered Internet Coalition, again, sort of born by both Vint Cerf and Mainland Fung, and like you said, it's now grown in numbers, and it's a coalition of the willing, really was looking at the challenge of the internet being accessible to all humans, and recognizing that in some respects, the advancements of what we call Web 2.0 and Web 3.0, and recognizing the web sits on top of the internet, it's not the entire internet, the very responsiveness that we have built into websites has also made it difficult for those that do need it to be accessible. I think you heard already from some of the speakers about how challenging it is to access just websites, and it gets even worse if you look at apps. Most apps right now do not have accessibility built in for folks of different modalities in which they need to receive it, whether it's actually helping with providing additional inputs if they need things in the visual realm or in the auditory realm. And so while we have made advancements on the user interface of the web from the early days, and I actually was a user of what was called Gopher and Archie protocols back in 1993, which was text-based, which in some respects was easier to be made accessible. But the very graphical advancements that we have seen that have happened have also unfortunately resulted in lack of digital accessibility, not just on websites, but increasingly with apps. And we heard, and we already were talking a little bit later about how can we make sure things that are either voice operated or involve some sort of intelligent component. I will use the word AI, but I'm not sure I will ascribe intelligence to AI. But I will just say that, if it's something where you're interacting with a machine, have you thought about how that interaction can be accessed by people of different modalities? I will also just say real quick, why we should all care about this is I've seen some statistics that are coming out of the NIH and others that say 1 in 4 people in their lifetime at some point in time will have an accessibility challenge. And so if we think about, most of us have extended family that's larger than 4 in number. And so that could be 1 in 4 of our family members, at least, that may have this need.
David, you are currently very active on the top of AI in public service. I'm personally very fascinated with the adoption that has been with generative AI. And you recently put out a call to action for the National Academy of Public Administration and from the future of AI and public services. Can you tell us a little bit about why now and why it's so critical this moment for this type of work?
Yes, so thank you for that question. And I would say, in some respects, this has been a long time coming. I like to remind people that AI actually dates back to the 1950s. Herbert Simon and several others, they were general problem-solving systems, and then we later had expert systems in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now we're beginning to see sort of some of the things that were thought of in the 80s, but we just lacked the computing power. And so I have the blessing and the curse sometimes of seeing the future, and Ray's sort of the same way too, where we see the future before everyone else sees it. And so I was actually advocating that public service needed to start thinking about this back in 2015 and 2016. But here we are now, where I think large language models have captivated people's attention anew on what has been a long trajectory with AI. And I like to tell people, while artificial intelligence, yes, the acronym is truly artificial intelligence, you need to also recognize that the machine is not thinking like humans. You would not take a 5 or 6 year old and expose it to 1 million images of a cat versus a dog, and after 1 million images expect the 5-year-old to know what a cat and a dog is. They'll probably know after about 10 or 12 images. They don't need that much data to do that. And so I think this is becoming important for public service because in some respects, public service has had a thing called Section 508, which requires accessibility to be built into government websites. We unfortunately, again, we heard a little bit about the ADA and this is sort of trying to encourage companies to do the same, but it could be that what government leads the way in when it thinks about how your data is going to help inform what's done through public service, how AI is actually going to interact with you. When do you need to know that you're interacting now with an AI agent versus an actual human? All these sort of things could be something that could then spill over into the private sector as well. At the same time, we have the challenge, and I would submit the private sector has this too, of a lot of legacy systems. In a past life, I spent 4 years as what I call digital diplomat and human flak jacket at the Federal Communications Commission as their CIO. And prior to my arrival, they'd had 9 CIOs in 8 years, which I say is a great sign for CIO number 10 that things are just going great. But I did last 4 years there, and we succeeded in modernizing several systems and at least moving to, at the time, private hosting or public cloud. One of the things that I did while I was at the FCC and then continued with the People-Centered Internet Coalition that VentSurf also amplified is as we think about doing human accessibility, and we sort of heard this from Francis as well, it's the same thing you need to do to make sure that the internet and the content on the internet and the web are accessible to machines and actually help with learning. If you don't think about how your responsive website, how you don't think about how your app is actually going to be some way available and accessible to inform a digital agent or an AI, it's going to actually be difficult for a human as well. And so in some respects, while I lead with people-centered, I lead with community-centered because obviously that matters. I would say that any forward-leaning business or government agency wanting to make sure they're relevant in the future has to bake in accessibility, if only to remain relevant in the AI era, while also accomplishing the goals of actually helping make sure things are accessible to humans.
David, that makes a lot of sense. And that also sounds like we're going to need a lot of co-creation for this to happen, right? And it's co-creation, not in the traditional sense of co-creation. It's going to come from different partners. Who do you see as some of those key principles that are going to be required for co-creation inside companies, inside public sector, of course, inside other startup organizations?
Yeah, so, I often try to figure out where can you get the biggest sort of proverbial bang for your buck in trying to tackle this, because this is obviously a multifaceted challenge. And I would say, first and foremost, the challenge begins with the development cycle, where a lot of developers are motivated to reuse reusable libraries. And again, I go back to responsive websites, I go back to apps, and a lot of those responsive libraries, while they're convenient, never thought about accessibility in terms of the code that developers are reusing. And so if they pick the wrong reusable library that has not baked in some sort of some accessibility into the responsiveness, then you're flat-footed from there on out. I hate to say it, that it's a problem that you have going forward. And so as we think about how we move forward and how we improve this situation, it begins first and foremost with the choice of how are your developers reusing code, how they're using different tools to even bake in accessibility from the start. And again, that also helps with accessibility on the AI side. The second thing I would say is it's about making sure when you do your usability testing, when you do your user experience testing and your A/B testing, if you're looking at different options, make sure you include a diverse set of humans in that. You may even actually be also able to include digital agents to actually help with that as well. But if you're not involving people in the testing phase of your user interface and UX, then don't be surprised that it's not happening either. And then finally, I think, especially in the era of AI, because we know these machines are going to behave sometimes predictably and sometimes unpredictably. Just like humans can hallucinate, guess what? So can machines. So I sort of put forward the acronym, which is ABLE, which is always be learning environments. That the best organization is one that is always recognizing that they have more to learn, that they don't assume they know everything. And if you look at the last decade, there may have been some large tech entities that thought they knew everything, or they didn't think about the second and third and fourth order effects of a product they rolled out. I submit that we're living in an era in which the best way to be alert for accessibility, best way to be alert for how AI is being used positively, but also possibly things that you might need to have guardrails on, is to always be learning environments, to be basically cultivating the ability that you actually have people that can actually give early warning if something's happening with whatever user experience that you've designed is either not available for humans, is not working on a certain screen reader, is not working in terms of a certain voice assistant, or similarly, your AI is doing something too. Because at the end of the day, you can plan for something to be used a certain way, but you may discover that other people are using in ways that either are not intended or actually misuse of the product.
Wow. You know, we talked a lot about here today how accessibility, it is about people, and it's done by people and for people. And we have to create it with people in mind, which we often, I think sometimes we forget. But who do you think is designing solutions today that put people at the center and others could learn from?
So actually, I will give a shout out to a quiet champion, and she didn't know I was going to do this. But there's a person by the name of Teresa Barreira, who is at the National Institutes of Health, and she, her story was she lost vision later in life, and she has been a thriver. She has been championing, actually thinking about this at the NIH and leading the way forward. You can find a bit of her online, but to me, it's an example of she saw a challenge. It was obviously personal to her, but she made it larger than her in terms of let's find solutions. And she has put forward that, as we look at technology advancements, not only do we need to think about how those technology advancements as we move forward for the next best thing might not be accessible and inclusive to all, but similarly, technology advancements are changing the modality in which people who have needs can actually interact with this content. And some may actually interact and choose to actually, we're now getting to the point where some people that have lost sight may be able to find actual ways to get sight back if they want. But actually, it's interesting. It's not a everyone's going in one way or another. There are cases where some people actually prefer to a certain path. And so, again, I go back to this could be any one of us. We never know what's going to happen in our life. We never know what's going to happen to our family members. And I think it's almost a human obligation to all of us to think about how we uplift this. But yeah, I would give a shout out to Teresa Barreira, who I've known now for more than a decade. And I would say she is an example of someone who is actually a positive change agent on a national scale.
Wow, it's a great point here. And as we talk about other technologies like AI and other things that are enhancing our capabilities to augment humanity, what are the risks and opportunities for improving digital accessibility? We've probably got less than 30 seconds here.
All right, the risk and the opportunities. The risk, you mislabel something, you mistag something, you think it's describing something that's not. The opportunities? Involve your customers, involve your citizens, involve your stakeholders, always be learning. If anything, that creates a tighter relationship with them. And so companies that do this not only will be doing the right thing for all of us, but actually getting to know their customers or citizens or constituents better.
Great closing thoughts here. Thank you so much for Dr. David Bray, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. So thanks for your insights. And of course, thanks for sharing a little bit of the historical perspective as well.
Great conversation, Ray.
Yeah,
I learned a lot
going on. Yeah, this has been interesting. I mean, we started out with the conversation talking about, what's happening today in terms of accessibility, how organizations, Alison was talking about how we could champion that internally and really why there's a need and demand. I couldn't believe less than 2% of websites, right, are accessible. We've learned more from Francis about what she was doing to pioneer some of these capabilities, thinking about how we did that, how we got from where we are today to where we are now. And I think that's really interesting about how we can invest more in digital inclusion, especially as we keep aging in place and more things will be happening to us. I was really not looking forward to that aging in place in future. I don't know about you, Teresa. Teresa, about that?
I'm not looking forward to that.
I'm not looking forward to that either.
I was like, no, I don't want to age. But, the big takeaway from me here is like accessibility is a human right. And we have to think of that way as it's done for people, but it's by people. It has to be intentional. And I feel that we haven't really, as a mindset, we haven't embraced it to say this is something we all have to do. Every company, every product. It's not an afterthought. It is not a silo. Something has to be embedded into every company. And I think that's really a mindset and it has to be really top down.
No, I definitely agree. It has to be a mindset. And then we got to Dr. David Bray. I think it was interesting to see how that cooperation is in place, how people are using technology. There are risks, right? And it's really in how we actually design it. So this has been a very exciting episode in Impact TV. Any final thoughts on your end?
No, I'm actually, this has been a great sort of awareness for me. So I feel like I can carry that message forward.
Well, this is great for the audience out there. Feel free to reach out to us. Follow Impact TV, follow the Publicis Sapient website, as well as at Publicis Sapient on Twitter. I'm Ray Wang with Constellation Research with my awesome co-host, Teresa Barreira, and we'll see you